Hi guys, welcome to Turn Your Lights On. I'm your host Emily, and each week I dive deeper and deeper into researching some of the most well-known or never heard of by my viewers before true crime cases. This week's case is one that I talked about on my first True Crimes Theory live stream with you guys, and you all showed great interest in this one. So I wanted to research it for you guys. This case got such widespread coverage because of all the twists and turns, and arguably one of the most unsuspecting twists in true crime. A theory so out there that even though it was plausible, it was practically unbelievable that the case ended up warranting two docuseries called An American Murder Mystery, The Staircase, and The Missing Pieces, The Staircase. Michael Peterson was a novelist, releasing books such as The Immortal Dragon and A Time of War, A Bitter Peace. Michael had also served as a Marine before becoming an author. He was the father of Clayton and Todd, his two sons, Margaret and Martha, who Michael became the guardian of after their parents, who were close friends of his and his ex-wife, had passed away, and his stepdaughter Caitlin. Michael was also a loving and devoted husband to his wife, Kathleen Peterson. Even though Michael and Kathleen's children were all within their adult years when Kathleen and Michael got married, the two families merged seamlessly. And at this point, Kathleen and Michael had been married for approximately 4 years. Kathleen Peterson was a telecoms executive. Both Michael and Kathleen's careers were allowing them to live a pretty lavish and comfortable lifestyle with their 5 children. Until one night that would change the way that many people would look at Michael from that day on. On December of 2001, in Durham, North Carolina, Kathleen Peterson was found by her husband, Michael Peterson, dead at the bottom of their staircase. Michael then called 911 in a state of pure panic and fear. Michael was in such disarray, and with his wife needing immediate medical attention, he actually called authorities a second time to urge them to hurry. Shortly after the second call to 911, at around 2:48 a.m., the paramedics had arrived to the Peterson home. And around the same time the paramedics arrived at the Peterson home, so did one of Michael's children, Todd. Upon their arrival, they walk into the home to an extremely gruesome and bloody sight. There was blood streaming down the walls, on the staircase. Kathleen's body had been consumed with blood. Paramedics did everything they could while Todd and Michael waited eagerly to hear what was going on with Kathleen. Unfortunately, paramedics weren't able to revive Kathleen, and with this news, Michael immediately took Kathleen into a tight embrace and held his wife's lifeless body. Kathleen was only 48 years old when she had tragically passed. Not long after 3 a.m. hits, a detective named Art Holland arrives. Upon entering the home, he was immediately taken aback by the amount of blood in the home. It was an awful lot for someone who had merely just fallen down the stairs at their home. And Art's instincts told him that he needed to get a search warrant to investigate the case further. Holland wanted to talk to Michael and Todd to continue to learn a little bit more about Kathleen while they waited for the forensics team to arrive. During their wait, Todd had told Art that his stepmother was on Valium, but she would often drink heavily even though she was on medication. Once the forensic team arrived on the scene, Michael immediately asked if he should get a lawyer, and to some investigating this case, this spoke volumes. But for others, they saw a concerned husband who paced and frantically roamed around his house and was very concerned with the situation at hand. Todd then proceeded to take control of the situation and called Michael's brother. Michael's brother was a lawyer in Las Vegas at the time, and he explained to Michael and Todd that at that moment in time, the way that the investigation was going down and with all of the questioning that Michael was receiving, he was actively getting treated as a suspect. Michael's brother then advised him to no longer speak to the authorities. One of the next people to arrive at the scene of the crime is a blood specialist named Dwayne Deaver. The evidence that Dwayne collected consisted of both Todd and Michael's clothes because they had both been covered in blood. They took photos, videos, and swatches of the crime scene. Besides blood evidence, investigators were able to find 2 wine glasses in the kitchen, one full and one empty, as well as a blood splatter on the kitchen cabinet, as well as one tiny droplet of blood on their porch steps leading into their home. Once this evidence was collected, the only thing to do was wait for toxicology reports to come back, as well as the results from the autopsy. While Michael awaited the news, he decided to lawyer up. He hired one of the best lawyers money could buy, David Rudolph, and David's support counsel, Thomas Marr. According to Dwayne, it would be nearly impossible for there to be that much blood, especially with it reaching almost 9 feet up the walls, if all that had happened was an accidental fall. With that solidifying detail, amongst other evidence, investigators believe they have enough proof to label this case as a homicide and convict Michael Peterson of the crime. On December 20th, just 11 days after Kathleen Peterson had passed, Michael turned himself in to the Durham police station. However, Michael continued to make public statements declaring his love for his wife and proclaiming that he's innocent. He was confident in the fact that his defense team would prove that to everyone in court. While Michael was in prison awaiting his trial, all of Kathleen and Michael's 5 children were making public statements as well. With how confident investigators were at this point that Michael had killed his wife, it was surprising that the statements made by their children were in defense of Michael. Todd, Clayton, Margaret, Martha, and Caitlin all rallied together to make statements defending Michael's innocence. They truly believed that Michael loved Kathleen and that they didn't believe he would ever do such a thing. On February 17, 2002, a major bomb would be dropped on this case. The autopsy report showed cuts and scratches all over Kathleen's face and arms, as well as 7 deep cuts in the back of her skull. And this information really strengthens the idea that Kathleen hadn't fallen down the stairs accidentally. When this information is brought to the attention of Kathleen's family, Caitlin begins to question her loyalty to her stepfather. The evidence was very damning. Michael's defense team were quick to combat this idea of Michael attacking his wife. The deep cuts and scratches that Kathleen had on her skull didn't match that of blunt force trauma. There were no neck or skull fractures or even bleeding in the brain. And usually, if there is blunt force trauma to the head, one or all of these instances tend to follow. The defense makes it a point to mention something that they felt had been overlooked throughout the entirety of the case up until this point. Michael Peterson had oftentimes been a critic of the Durham police and made his thoughts known to many. Marr and Rudolph pointed this out because they felt as though authorities were quick to jump on the idea that this was a homicide. The defense went as far as to recruit Henry Lee, an investigative specialist, to join their team. On the other hand, prosecutors were determined to find a murder weapon in order to prove that Michael had done this. According to Kathleen's sister, she had given Kathleen a blowpoke for their fireplace, but after Kathleen's death, it had been missing from their home. With no murder weapon, investigators begin searching the home again, and they find that Michael had been sending emails back and forth between him and a male escort. Michael was in the process of trying to buy sex from this male escort. Authorities were able to retrieve hundreds of pictures of pornography deleted from Michael's computer. as well as finding out that the Peterson family had been in a stressful financial situation. Not long after this information was discovered, Art Holland had gotten a phone call. Someone wanted to leave him a tip that could help him with the case. It was the aunt of Margaret and Martha, Michael's 2 adopted daughters. She told Art that just 17 years prior to the death of Kathleen Peterson, her sister, Elizabeth Ratliff, had died. She wanted Detective Holland to look into her sister's case. 20 years prior to the death of Kathleen, Elizabeth and her husband had become friends with Michael Peterson and his first wife while they were all living in Germany. The couples had met because Michael's wife Patty and Elizabeth were both teachers at a school on a military base. And the couples became very close very quick. But unfortunately, not long after, Elizabeth's husband had died during a military exercise. Elizabeth was riddled with grief and stress because now she was a single mother to her 2 daughters, Margaret and Martha. Michael and Patty urged Elizabeth to move closer to them so that they could help her with her struggles, and she ended up buying the house right next door to the couple. Elizabeth and Michael grew to be close friends because Michael was there for her in her time of grief. But on November 4th of 1985, tragedy would strike Elizabeth's family again. The Petersons had hosted a dinner for both families, and at the end of the night, Michael walks her and her 2 girls home. The next morning, around 7 a.m., Elizabeth's nanny walks into her home to discover that Elizabeth was at the bottom of her staircase in a pool of her own blood. And sadly, Elizabeth Ratliff had passed, and Michael Peterson was the last person to see her alive. When questioned by police, Michael told authorities that Elizabeth had some health issues that may have been responsible for her death. She suffered from headaches and a blood disorder, and the cause of her death had been an accidental fall. She had had a bleed in her brain, and Elizabeth's will had stated that Michael and Patty would get her estate and would take custody of her children. Once Michael and Patty officially adopted Martha and Margaret, they returned to the United States. Patty and Michael would divorce shortly after this, and the kids would choose to live with Michael. Investigators thought this entire situation was very interesting, though. Elizabeth and Kathleen looked eerily similar, had both died from a fall down the stairs with an extensive amount of blood, and Michael Peterson was the last person to see both of them alive. However, there was never a proper investigation for Elizabeth Ratliff's case, so Margaret and Martha give authorities permission to dig their mother's body up in hopes that it would clear their stepfather's name. However, it did the exact opposite. When an autopsy was performed on Elizabeth, the same cuts were found on the back of her skull, very similar to the ones that were found on Kathleen. However, Michael's team is quick to speak on the matter, stating that these 2 autopsies aren't individual, but they are in fact being done by the same person. The defense was quick to share with jurors that Michael Peterson had raised Elizabeth's children as his own, and that they were pridefully standing with him during this time. Yet, the prosecutors decided to bring someone from Michael's past to take the stand. The male escort that Michael had numerous online interactions with. But it was admitted to jurors that Michael had told the escort that he was happily married, and that Michael had told him that his wife knew about their situation. And while many didn't believe this because Kathleen had left her first husband because he had cheated on her, Michael continued to claim that Kathleen had known all along. Dwayne Deaver was the next person to be called to the stand. While being questioned, he stated that he had done multiple experiments and that the only way that the blood would have splattered the way it did was if Michael Peterson had been over top of Kathleen, hitting her repeatedly. Duane said that there was other evidence that supported this theory as well. This evidence included Michael's shoes. When investigators had entered the Peterson home, Michael hadn't been wearing any, but during the second investigation, a pair of Michael's shoes had been found and the bottoms were covered in blood, as well as finding a shoe print on Kathleen's sweatpants that matched the shoes investigators found. And Rudolph was quick to combat these accusations. He wasn't giving up without a fight, and he gave a fight. While Rudolph did his own questioning, he discovered that documents that Deaver claimed he had given to the prosecutors were never seen by him or his defense team, and the prosecuting team claimed they didn't have them. But Deaver claimed that there was no blood splatter found on Michael's shirt. So how would it be possible that Michael could have been over top of Kathleen attacking her, but there was no blood splatters on his shirt, only his pants? Not having this documentation was a major violation and wasn't something that Rudolph was going to take lightly. However, the judge decides that this was just a simple mistake, and the case continued to carry on. The trial continued. On July 22nd, a judge decided that Elizabeth Ratliff's case information would be allowed in the trial. However, Henry Lee continues to come to the defense's side by explaining that there could be a very simple explanation to the blood splatter everywhere. If Kathleen had hit her head, the blood could have gotten into her airways and she could have spit it everywhere. But prosecutors combated this theory with the fact that during the autopsy, there was no blood found in Kathleen's airways. After much more trial and deliberation, the jurors had decided that Michael Peterson was guilty and was convicted of the murder of Kathleen Peterson. Todd, Clayton, Margaret, and Martha were devastated, while Caitlin was happy that she felt her mother got the justice that she deserved. While Michael was in jail, his children continued to support him, and his defense team, well, they weren't done yet. They still believed that Michael was inaccurately convicted. Michael's former neighbor, Larry Pollard, had decided to help with the continued investigation. Larry dove further into the autopsy report. Larry immediately picked up the fact that the cuts on Kathleen's head had all been the same size. That would be awfully hard to do with a blunt force object. But that wasn't the only thing that stuck out to Larry. Kathleen had also had a handful of her own hair, and with this hair, there was a feather. Which brings us to the theory that sets this case apart from any other true crime case: the owl theory. David Rudolph does an awesome job of explaining what the owl theory is on his website, so I wanted to share some of that information with you guys. It was proven that barred owls had been living behind the Petersons' home, and this wouldn't be the first time barred owls had ever attacked someone. While it wasn't a common occurrence for someone to be attacked by one, there has been numerous occasions where people have been attacked. There was also talks of why there was a blood droplet on their patio. The blood looked like it had been dropped straight down onto the patio, so according to prosecutors, they believed that the blood had fallen off of the murder weapon. However, with the owl theory, it may have been that Kathleen had been struck by the owl and stumbled into her home while being attacked. And that's when she had fallen down the stairs. That would also make sense why there was a blood smear on the outside of the door as well. Allegedly, the cuts and scratches on Kathleen's face were also consistent with the beak of an owl. David Rudolph goes into more detail on his website about more evidence that relates to the owl theory. While this is a theory as to why Kathleen had sadly passed away, it is important to understand that all this evidence is circumstantial. Now back to what we do know. In 2017, Michael entered an Alford plea after serving nearly 8 years in prison. His sentence was reduced to voluntary manslaughter and he was released from prison. This was due to the questioning of the integrity of the original trial. And that's as far as we know about the Kathleen Peterson case to date. While researching this case, I thought that the owl theory was very plausible. If Kathleen's cuts were compatible to an owl's beak and claws, and there was a bloody feather clenched in her fists, I definitely think it's a possibility. However, many are skeptical of this theory because Kathleen's injuries are identical to Elizabeth's. And what are the odds that an owl had attacked Elizabeth 17 years prior in a different country, gave her the exact same injuries, and Michael Peterson was the last person to see either of them alive? But I am no judge, no lawyer, and no investigator, so I'll leave all the thoughts and speculations to the professionals. I do think that the owl theory makes this case stand out from most true crime cases, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts and theories on it. What do you think happened to Kathleen Peterson? I would love to know. Make sure to drop a comment down below so I can see your guys' thoughts. But that's all I have for this week. Thank you all for being here for another case, and I will see you guys next week with a case that'll leave you so scared, you'll have to turn your lights on.